Hello again. How is everybody? Good. I'm glad to hear it. So today, the U.S. during the early Cold War, 1 minute to midnight. To make it dramatic and to make it extra dramatic, we have a picture of a mushroom cloud on the left-hand side of the screen, as I'm sure you've already noticed. The 1 minute to midnight reference, it's a title of a book, but the author got that from a clock that the Atomic Energy Commission has in place and still does, where they basically use a clock to make their prediction about how close the world is at any one time or another to a nuclear war or nuclear holocaust. And in recent years, it's been like at a minute and a half to midnight, which is the closest it's ever been. It's a prediction; they could be wrong, but it's still somewhat sobering to think of it. So we're going to look in this unit primarily at the foreign policy aspects of the Cold War. At the very end, we'll look at some of the ways that the Cold War foreign policy affected domestic politics and society in a very specific and direct way. In the next unit that follows this one, we'll talk about American society, domestic politics during the early Cold War period, with far less connection and reference to the Cold War, although a little even there. So there's some overlap, but here it's primarily foreign policy during the early Cold War years, late 40s, 50s, 60s, and the next unit, domestic politics during that same period. So we must start with some definitions. If we're going to talk about something known as the Cold War, we best know what it means. And there's no easy definition for this. But what we're looking at is the contours of a long-term conflict between the superpowers, as they became known after World War II. I mentioned this when we dealt with that conflict, but two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged from that war head and shoulders above everyone else in terms of power and wealth, political, military prowess in the world. Before World War II, during World War II, there were several major powers of the world. Now, after World War II, there are only two superpowers. And they become each other's arch rivals very quickly. And throughout the Cold War, which doesn't end until between 1989 and 1991. We're just covering the first decades here today. But there was mutual hostility, suspicion, fear, planning against. The United States saw the Soviet Union correctly as its greatest rival, its most powerful foe, and vice versa. Each side had reason to fear the other one. Although they tended to sometimes on both sides get irrational about it and paranoid about it. So there was reason to fear, but sometimes they feared beyond what was normal. Like the old saying goes, just because you're crazy, just because you're paranoid, doesn't mean they're not following you. So these two societies were somewhat paranoid of each other, especially at the height of the Cold War, but they had some reason to be, at least a little bit. Both were antagonistic and competing ideologies, and this is another feature of the Cold War. So the United States, of course, is by the post-war period the leading capitalist democracy in the world, and the Soviet Union started by being the one and only communist country in the world, but there are others coming into being during the process of the Cold War. But communism and capitalism, communism and democracy, at least how they've played out in the world, don't exactly make for natural allies. Now, you might be saying, yeah, but they were allies just back, a little while back during World War II. True. But the only reason was that Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany represented such a threat to both that they felt they had no choice but to, for the time being, temporarily put their differences aside and come together to defeat the common enemy and foe. Without Hitler being a menace to both, there's no way these two would have come together. So it makes perfect sense that once Hitler is vanquished, Germany is defeated in the Second World War, that the alliance between the United States and Britain on one side and the Soviet communists on the other starts to disintegrate very quickly. And we're going to look into that, of course, going forward here. So there's an overall freezing of relations, hence Cold War. The two sides, for the reasons mentioned above and some things we haven't talked about yet, don't they're not amicable towards each other. There is a breakdown even of talking to each other at times, not always, but there's definitely sort of a great deal of tension in the air, and they do see each other as enemies. Now, this is a Cold War and not a hot war, so that is to say that the U.S. and Soviet Union never did go to war with each other here in this long, decades-long conflict, but they kind of did. So there was never a direct war between the two, but there were some proxy wars, meaning one time or another, one or both of them supported armies or political parties in one country or another who were fighting another faction for control of the same country. The United States was prone to supporting anti-communist forces or parties. The Soviet Union was prone to supporting communist or socialist parties or armies when there are civil wars in various parts of the world and different groups are vying for power. The U.S. And Soviets fought each other unknowingly on a few occasions, or at least the U.S. Didn't know that in some wars where the Soviet Union and or communist China were fighting sort of a proxy war, they were sometimes sending pilots who were fighting, not a lot, but here and there against American, pilots in the Air Force or Navy. The United States, of course, sent troops to Vietnam to support or defend against communism there. The Chinese communists and the Soviets did support Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam and the Viet Cong communists in South Vietnam against U.S. forces and the South Vietnamese government being propped up by the U.S. So in all kinds of ways, it's almost as if there was constant warfare going on between the two, but they never actually had a formal, knockdown, drag out of a war between themselves. They also came very close to war with each other on a number of occasions too. So it was a near miss a couple of times, most, I think, severely or most closely in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Another defining feature of the Cold War, as you see here, is a gigantic arms race between the two superpowers. Even more frightening than that, there was a nuclear arms race. So conventional weapons are being built up by both sides. Each side feels a desperate need to keep up with or stay ahead of or catch up to the other side with regard to bombers, submarines, planes, tanks, etc., but also with regard to nuclear weapons and intercontinental, I haven't been drinking, I swear, ballistic missiles. It's a tongue twister. It really is. Also, and this is the last point here, but this sometimes I think goes under the radar, and it really needs, I think, to be stressed. Both superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviets, were both trying to kind of sell the rest of the world on their vision of the world, their way of doing things, right? One sort of the communist way, the other the capitalist democratic way. And the United States was, this phrase I didn't make up, it's been around, but was trying to create a new world order. During World War II, it became apparent quickly that the United States was going to have a unique opportunity to shape the world in its own image, the way it wanted the world to be, more than ever before, in its own history by far, and that it couldn't, at least the dominant opinion, these are internationalists now, having taken hold of the reins of power, saying we're going to have to take a leadership role in the world and create and become the leaders of an international capitalist economy. This wasn't anything brand new, by the way. The British had done more or less the same thing in the previous 19th century. They led a world capitalist order. with London being the center of world finance and really kind of the global commercial world. And now the United States is bound and determined to do the same thing. So in order to do that, some of the countries have to be kind of persuaded to go along. And it's not an easy sell to do. One of the reasons it's not an easy sell is because Americans, when faced with the question, had to basically admit that this was going to be more to the United States' benefit as the leader of the New World capitalist order than anyone else's who happened to, sort of become a member, but not the leader. So smaller countries who are somewhat suspicious, understandably, would say and did say, wait a minute, so if we come aboard and cooperate and sort of do things your way, into your sort of sphere of activity, with you kind of setting the rules, you're the one who's going to do better than anyone else. And the more of us you get to agree to be kind of under your leadership, the better you're going to do. And Americans, leaders, had really no choice but to say, well, you're right. We are going to do better than you, but you're still going to do better coming along under our wing than you'll do if you stay out and try to stay neutral, or if you go over to the Soviet side and sort of go under their protective wing. And that very well may have been true. I actually would conclude, from my own perspective, that was true. But it's still a tough thing to sell because it doesn't sound right. If that's actually true, it would be irrational not to do it. Though you can still see why somebody would not want to. Meaning that if I offer you a deal and you say, hey, wait a minute, if I take that deal and we cooperate on the deal, you're going to do better than me. And I say, yes, that's true, but you're still going to do better by taking the deal, right, and getting some advantage out of it, even though I get more advantage than you would if you don't take the deal at all. You'll do worse. So it's still in your rational self-interest to go along, even if I'm going to do better than you are out of the deal. So I think there's a very good chance that was true. But the Soviets tried to throw a monkey wrench into this anyway, because they've got their door-to-door salesman, not literally, but it's kind of as if the United States is going to what were called third world countries, poor countries, Asia, Africa, rest of the world, and knocking on the door, the sales pitch, door-to-door salesman. They got a brochure out, and the Americans, of course, are going to use the beauties of capitalism, at least as they saw it, democracy, freedom, equality, sort of play up the American value system, the American way of life, the American Constitution, our prosperity, standard of living, and that's an easier sell, certainly, than what the Soviets have to offer, because they don't have that much to offer. But the Soviets were quite clever. Knowing they didn't have that much to offer, what they did is sort of come to the door, again, metaphorically speaking, and say, hey, was that American salesman that I just saw leaving, your driveway here? Yeah, it was. Was he giving you that sort of BS about the American system being so wonderful? And, yeah, he was. Is it really BS? Well, yeah, of course it's BS. In fact, ma'am, if you look behind you, look at your TV. It's on. What's going on your TV there? I don't know. There's some demonstrations and riots. Where? In Birmingham, Alabama. Well, what's going on there? Well, African Americans are being beaten by white policemen for trying to demonstrate for the right to vote. Oh, so that's the American system that you're talking about, huh? So the racism and discrimination against people of color, particularly African Americans, that's something that's equates with equality and freedom. Well, no. See, the American system is BS. So the Soviets were clever because they knew they didn't have that much positive to sell about their own system. So they focused on the weaknesses of the American system, and the soft underbelly of the American system was clearly race relations in the country. So much so that one of the things, I'm not saying the only, but one of the things that caused the U.S. government during this period, a bit after where we are right now, to finally start working at cleaning up its act and getting the government more involved in civil rights, promotion of civil rights and equal rights for African Americans, more than they've done since the era of Reconstruction that we talked about early on in the course. So it's sad to say it this way, but it does appear that, at least in part, American leaders, the U.S. government, started to do the right thing with regard to race relations, however, slowly, gradually, for the wrong reasons. That they were doing it primarily so they'd have a better chance of selling their overall system to the rest of the world, to be get everyone to join the capitalist U.S.-led New World Order. They have a better chance if they cleaned up their Race Relations Act, especially when they realize that the Soviet Union is capitalizing on that weakness and publicizing it as much as possible. So this is actually a big part of what we would sort of call the Cold War. One thing that makes the Cold War confusing, and there are many, but the old internationalism / isolationism conflict is still kind of going on. But I've mentioned before that post-World War II, and here we are, the internationalists have won. There are still some isolationists in Congress at this time and for quite some time afterwards, but they're no longer the majority and they won't be. One could argue that they've come back in just the last several years here in our country, but not for decades before that. But the Cold War is largely then defined, to put kind of a blanket over everything we said, between conflict between the superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, over capitalism versus communism, or communism in the Soviet Union versus anti-communism in the United States and the Western capitalist world, allies of the U.S. like Great Britain and others. So how does internationalism fit then with anti-communism as both elements of American foreign policy? Well, it's not always clear to and easy to disentangle them. Sometimes they're very much tangled up together. But one way to see it, this isn't true, I think, in every foreign policy, issue, every event that takes place, but it does appear that sometimes, even when American foreign policy had little or nothing to do with communism and anti-communism, the Cold War, it was still sold that way. There were times where it may have been just a more internationalist, straightforward, idea or notion of American strategic economic interests being put forward in that part of the world, hence an aggressive foreign policy in that part of the world, but not really much having to do with communism itself. Sometimes it was both. But American leaders, what I'm getting at, recognized that just saying that, hey, we have economic interests somewhere, so support, our war effort. Be willing to send your son off to, get shot at and die possibly to, pursue internationalist goals. That's harder to sell than if you can scare them with, hey, that's the communists. The reason your son has to go over there is because communism, the Soviet Union, right? The evils of communism are every time they win, somewhere abroad, they're getting closer and closer to the U.S., which of course could have been true. There was some truth to it, but sometimes this does suspiciously appear to be too easy a sell. Americans got so frightened of communism, partly because of government propaganda, other things that we'll see that led them in that direction, that it's like the U.S. kind of just had the U.S. government could just press a button. Okay, we need to hit the fear button, the communist button, so we'll just sort of, to a dial. Let's dial that up a couple of notches or whatever, and tell them we need to fear the communists more than ever before, and then we can get the public to, sort of do what we want. There's a different knob or button today. It's not communism any longer, it's terrorism. But it has some of the same features to it. Not that terrorism isn't a real threat, of course it is. But it can be, and sometimes I think is manipulated to sort of heighten fear to get Americans to support this or that policy, this or that measure. That was a long time for one slide, but that was our introduction. There's a great deal, of course, to say critical of American foreign policy, and we have in other units up until now, particularly when we get into the post-World War II era. Korea's coming up, Vietnam, Iraq, in our class. So I'm not denying that there's a lot to be criticized there that's worthy of being criticized, that needs to be criticized. But we get so caught up in all that, I think that we sometimes fail to look at another or other possibilities. That it's tougher, more difficult, I think, than that, just to sort of paint sort of a good versus evil picture. Either the U.S. is totally good or it's totally evil in its foreign policy. I like to try to find balance by looking at all or both sides of issues. Here I'm doing it one more time. What's sometimes called the flawed masterpiece, the U.S.-led post-war liberal capitalist democratic world order, that's a mouthful, that we've just alluded to in the previous slide, started off with the United States doing what I would argue is the most successful social engineering project of all time. In fact, it might be the only successful large-scale social engineering project of all time. And this barely gets any mention at all. And I think it's a good example of how the tendency in academia, specifically, and our society more generally, is to now be so critical of U.S. foreign policy that we don't ever say anything positive. In fact, we've scrubbed clean our memories of anything you might say positive about it. But some of this you'll be familiar with, even though we don't really focus on it very much. I'm proposing, and we're going to focus on it here, rebuilding Germany, Japan, and Europe economically and politically. Now, the United States will see help to rebuild our allies in Europe during World War II, but we also forced Germany and Japan to rebuild our arch enemies just after the war. And we put a ton of money into helping them to rebuild economically and politically. And we didn't just help them to put governments and constitutions in place in Germany and Japan. We forced democracies on them. We had troops occupying those countries, particularly in Japan, for a long period of time, and forced democratic constitutions and democratic systems on them. Now, one could say, well, that's typical of the United States, going, to other parts of the world and telling other people what to do and assuming their way is the right way. And oftentimes, I think that's sort of a correct, or at least perfectly valid way to look at it. But in this case, we're talking about two countries that had, over the past 6 or so years, proceeded to wreck the world, in an attempt to dominate through all kinds of, non-democratic, undemocratic values. So one could argue, I think, and I'm arguing it right here, that Germany and Japan needed to be told, at least at this point, what type of government they were going to have, and it wasn't going to be, a fascist, Nazi type government. You're going to become democracies. And so, with a stroke, the United States put in place two democracies that have stayed democracies ever since, and in the two countries that caused the most trouble leading to and through World War II. And neither country has gone to war ever since. Now, that's not just because of the United States, pushing these countries to do the right thing, but because German leaders and Japanese leaders were committed to doing it, in tandem, in partnership with the U.S. Nonetheless, this I still think deserves to be thought of as a great success in American foreign policy, and yet it's a meddling American foreign policy. The United States then, throughout the Cold War, used its own military power to deter any country from trying to overturn the world order. It basically made a deal, a tacit deal, unwritten deal with the European countries, its greatest allies, and Japan, that the United States will do the heavy military lifting as long as the European countries and the other allies don't do any of the military heavy lifting. And you think, well, okay, that's not fair. In recent times, we've had a backlash against that type of thinking and policy. So it seems to have maybe reached its limits. Nonetheless, again, essentially what the United States was saying is, look, we're not going to allow Germany and Japan and the rest of Europe to handle potential military situations, because look what happened in 1914 and 1939. Two world wars, within 20 years of each other. No. We're going to sort of give them the resources to rebuild their economies. They did. And set up democratic systems. We did. They did. And then we're going to handle the military sort of aspect of things to keep the world order under our leadership, with their success as part of it, in place, so that, because we can't trust them to do it, because Europe has been the center of two global wars. So we also then encouraged, rewarded, assisted countries that bought in to the new world capitalist democratic world order, and found ways to kind of punish those that didn't. We'll see one way that it was done. In a very recent book, just coming out this last year, that deals with this subject, Hal Brands says, and his co-author, the U.S. undertook to build preponderant military might so as to ensure that the global balance of power would never tilt decisively against America and the democratic world. Smothered under a blanket of American commitment and dominance, many of the long-running geopolitical conflicts that had previously afflicted the Western world vanished. The U.S. would not withdraw from the geopolitical competition this time around, meaning, unlike World War I, we went right back to isolationism again. America's post-war leaders were acutely aware of how precarious and easily disrupted international peace had traditionally been. International order had to be reinforced when challenged. President Truman understood, as fighting limited war now could reduce the chances of global war later. Eternal vigilance was the price of an enduring peace. So that the United States was willing to play world's policeman as the one power, at least in the capitalist democratic world, that could do so, and realized not only to pay dividends for us, but for reward our allies, which could boomerang back to us in benefits as well. All countries within the U.S.-led order staying healthy and prosperous, that sort of benefits everyone in the group. As the great 19th century German statesman said, "Fools learn by experience, wise men learn by others' experience." And so this is sort of a way to say that the United States leaders were sort of looking around the world and what had worked and what hadn't worked before, and this thinking went into the Flawed Masterpiece. Flawed? Why flawed? Because certainly even once the system did get put into place in most parts of the world, most countries, however reluctantly, accepting membership in this U.S.-led world order, the United States still made stupid mistakes and was involved in one cruelty after another. So it's a deeply flawed masterpiece. Iraq, as an example, that gets lots of criticism, that kind of fits into the New World capitalist order. But nonetheless, I still think that this was a brilliant stroke that gets almost no attention these days. One has to wonder, and maybe it would have turned out the same anyway, whether the world would have stayed peaceful, at least relatively. The major powers, say, that had fought World War II, if they would have stayed peaceful, over the long haul, as long as they have now, if it hadn't been for the United States absolutely insisting that things get sort of done a different way, and having the power and the audacity and stick-to-itness to make it happen. So the post-war order and the Cold War is a major turning point in U.S. foreign policy, to be sure. The new American credo could be said to be: the U.S. must assume global leadership and a policing role. Basically, as already stated, the U.S. military must have a global presence, global power projection, and global intervention capabilities. So it's got to have a potential presence anywhere and all over the world, and we'll see that it does establish just that. Another sort of addendum to this, the U.S. Corollary must always be in at least semi-war mode. In the post-war era, up until at least the 80s, there was quite a bit of talk about a permanent war economy, that the United States has to, or does anyway, build so many weapons to try to keep up with our arch superpower rival, the Soviet Union, that we're producing guns and submarines and ships, and planes and tanks at almost like a wartime level. But there were many Americans and leaders, business, political, military, that thought if we stopped doing that, the economy could crash because so many people are employed in industries that are supplying the military in this competition with the Soviet Union. Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the presidents of the early Cold War, we've already met, the guy that beat Hitler, and in the next unit we'll talk more about his presidency. But here, I just want to note that as he was leaving office, his farewell address and some of his other writings in office, he showed signs of being uncomfortable with certain aspects of American policy during the Cold War, particularly what he called, in his farewell address, the military-industrial complex. He was a guy that, of course, knew warfare so well, having been Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, that he sort of saw military spending with a sort of hawk eye, and he knew, when to call bullshit. Because, it is true that the various services, whether it be the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, they're usually going to try to get, as many dollars from the government as they can. And so there is a tendency, I'm not saying it happens all the time, I'm not saying there's no honesty, but there is a tendency, at least at times, for weapons to be sold, to be made, that don't even really need to be made, that aren't really necessary from a military or strategic perspective. And other presidents may have been more easily fooled on these kind of things. I guess we need it. The Army is telling us we need this weapon that costs billions. But Eisenhower was tough to BS in that regard because he knew military weaponry and the procurement process so well. But as part of this overall fear that economics in some ways is going to drive military spending and not necessarily strategic military need, he also liked to sort of compare or point out, as economists knew and other leaders and scholars knew, that when you spend, resources are finite. That's one of the basic lessons of economics. Resources are finite, and so if you spend money on this, sometimes you don't have money for that. So he wanted to make sure that things were prioritized carefully as well. So here's some excerpts from his farewell and from some of his other speeches and writings that are similar to that. He said, "I'm getting awfully sick of the lobbies by the munitions industry," meaning defense industries. You begin to see this thing isn't wholly the defense of the country, but only more money for some who are already fat cats. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. I believe that was a brilliant stroke on his part to sort of compare the cost of one heavy bomber to something very tangible, in a modern community, in a town, something of great value. Electric power plants, hospitals, modern brick schoolhouse. He's saying if we lean too heavily on the military side, especially when we don't need to, it's being driven by corporate need and not American strategic and national security need, then we're actually taking money away from things that really matter to societies and sort of for them to live prosperously and for humans to live flourishing lives. We noted a moment ago that the United States needed to have global power projection, or at least it believed it did in the Cold War. And there's some, I think, sense in believing that this was true. The Soviet Union was a massive country. It had, if not global power projection, but large scale projection. So the United States was going to potentially have to very much enlarge its own foreign policy if it was going to, keep up with the other superpower. There are two institutions, both of which were created at the beginning of the Cold War. So you can see these as Cold War institutions, one of which isn't really around any longer. The other one very much is around. The first on the left, the Strategic Air Command, headed at the time by Curtis LeMay, an Air Force general from World War II, who had developed and continued to develop a reputation of being a brutal individual. Might have been a bit unfair, but he did talk tough about the need to use high altitude bombing on a massive scale to win wars and to keep the threat of doing so in the future, to keep countries in place. There were some Americans on the left that thought he was a madman, just a sort of a warmonger type guy. And it's possible that he was, but it's also possible that he was, and he still was an asset to the U.S. vis-a-vis, its enemies in the world, or potential enemies, because he had a tendency to scare people. Whether he, meant to follow through or not, he sometimes made some scary statements. The technology in the Air Force and the armed forces in general improved a great deal after the war, and continue to, of course. But I think the one piece of technology to keep in mind here, as far as power projection capability is concerned, is the, at the time, basically new B-52 bombers. Remember, we talked about in our unit on the Pacific War in World War II that the U.S. had to get pretty close to Japan to be within bombing range. But with B-52s and other bombers since then, bombers can go, massive distances without having to refuel. And the B-52 is kind of really the first one that was a potent, weapon in our military arsenal that could get around the world. So this is the technological side of America's new power projection capability. The other institution, kind of in tandem with the Strategic Air Command, was the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. It's fairly common for Americans, I think, to feel like the CIA's always been around in our history. But not that we didn't have intelligence capability before, but this organization, federal government organization, wasn't formed and created until 1947. So this is very much, the CIA, a Cold War institution. It was founded mainly out of a perceived need to, gather more and better intelligence, primarily on the Soviet Union, although in time it did much more than that. You see pictured here Alan Dulles, the third director of Central Intelligence, not the first, only because he's the first one that really kind of turned it into sort of the agency that we're used to today, both for good and bad reasons. But Dulles became known for, or is at least known now, for playing pretty fast and loose with the CIA. He did some pretty dangerous and reckless things, so he's come under some fire by scholars in recent years. Nonetheless, the CIA is a great example of the U.S.'s intention and ability to project itself, inject itself into other parts of the world. During the early Cold War years, the CIA failed at a lot of things. But one thing that it did extremely well was to influence elections overseas, which is kind of funny since we've been talking a great deal in recent years about our country being having to deal with interventions in our elections by foreign powers. But the United States certainly did so during the Cold War. Italy is a good example of a place where the U.S. not only intervened politically with the CIA taking a covert role in putting money behind one political party, then another one, preferred political party, and getting positive results out of it. So the United States is injecting power or projecting power around the world in Strategic Air Command's case in a more obvious way, sort of a sledgehammer way, and in Dulles' case with the CIA, a more stiletto, quiet way. The guy you see here in front of you is the most important person in this class that you've never heard of until now, George F. Kennan, a brilliant intellectual, worked for the State Department for decades and decades, and no, those dates of birth and death are not a mistake. He lived to be 101 years old. So, and he worked in the State Department and other government agencies for the better part of his adult life, and served several presidents, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. He's a great example of what's called a lifer. Lifers are those that work in the federal bureaucracy and administrations, either civil servants, or in this case, this guy's kind of like a think tank guy, but they're not political appointees. They don't come and go with a particular president and a party. Those are the people at the very top that become the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, etc. But the lifers are the ones just below them, or even below that, that basically get full-time jobs for life, and so they end up becoming extremely valuable, invaluable, because they're the ones that end up having the most experience. So assistant, secretaries of state, or at least if they're not appointed, because to some levels from the top down are still appointed positions. I forget where the cutoff point is, but if you're at the top rung of those that stay and aren't ousted along with the president when he leaves and another group brought in, you're invaluable, because you understand sort of, you have the institutional memory, you have a great deal of experience, you probably know how your agency works, better than anybody else, certainly better than anyone else that's coming in that's new. And so the new people that are your bosses tend to listen to you, pretty intently. At least if they're good leaders, they do. If they don't listen to you, they're not good leaders. So Kennan was one of these classic examples of a professional lifer, and one of the most famous. Not all of them, of course, are famous. Most of the lifers are just bureaucrats, civil servants that do their jobs, sometimes extremely well, but aren't famous people because of it. Kennan, during World War II, as a diplomat, was stationed in Moscow, in the Soviet Union, not as the ambassador, though he did a stint as ambassador during the Cold War for a short time. Also did a short stint as ambassador to Yugoslavia during the Cold War, although he didn't make a great ambassador. He was a better thinker, writer, planner, strategist, and so his most effective moments working for the government came in that capacity. But as a expert on the Soviet Union, he was stationed at the embassy there to kind of do studies and sort of give advice about what he saw happening in Soviet society and government. And in 1946, as the war had just ended, he was still there. And American leaders at that time, President Truman by 46, just before that President Roosevelt, seemed to have an idea that Stalin, though they knew he was difficult to deal with, that the U.S. could probably kind of coax him, convince him to compromise over this or that post-war issue. There were a lot of post-war issues, bones of contention between the Soviets and the U.S., or the Soviets on one side, U.S. and Great Britain on the other. A great example is Poland. The United States wanted to have free and fair elections in Poland, democratic government, and Stalin didn't. And so there's one area of contention. But American leaders I think they overestimated their own ability and underestimated Stalin's obdurate nature. And because Kennan just thought there's no way that the Soviet Union is going to compromise on any of this stuff. No way. We might as well forget that we were ever allies, because they're not going to play as allies, now that the war is over. And he was certainly right about this, at least from our perspective now, but there were a few others that I think saw this as well. It was partially because of Stalin's own personality, that he just wasn't going to. He's not the kind of guy that compromised. He wasn't used to compromising. If he didn't have to, and he didn't have to, since the Soviet Red Army occupied the Eastern European countries, including Poland. A good rule of thumb post World War II, Cold War era, is that where the Soviet Red Army goes, the Soviet Red Army stays. So the Soviet Army had rolled through the Eastern European countries in the process of pushing Nazi German forces back into Germany, and then ensconced themselves in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, etc., East Germany, and they didn't leave. And so Stalin wasn't the type, why should I compromise over Poland? I've got troops there. They don't. What are they going to do? Nothing. Then I'm not budging. So Kennan understood this in a way that his boss Truman, Roosevelt, certainly I think had not understood that. Roosevelt was so used to charming people, with his ability to schmooze, that I think he thought he could even charm Stalin, which is laughable, at least from our vantage point to this day. But there was, I think, a bigger reason that Kennan kept saying over and over, and he starts to send cables and telegrams back to the U.S. about how American policy is deeply flawed because it seems to have this underlying assumption that their cooperation with the Soviet Union is possible. He's saying it's not possible. We need to get that in our heads now. They're an adversary, and we need to treat them as such. He wasn't saying go to war. We need to understand they're not going to sit down at the table and bargain and deal with us honestly. The other and bigger reason was that this is a communist country based on Marxist principles and ideas, and Marxism, its lifeblood, at least as far as propaganda was concerned, was sort of always criticizing the capitalist, imperialist countries. Great Britain, the United States, at least it saw it as an imperialist country. And so its whole ideology was so anti-capitalist, so anti-British, so anti-American, because they were capitalist countries, that Stalin recognized, probably accurately, or believed, probably accurately, that if he's seen as cooperating with the United States after World War II, it's forgivable during World War II, with the Nazis threatening to take Moscow, but after World War II, the whole reason for being of the Soviet Union, its whole, its own value system was predicated on opposition to the U.S. and Britain as imperialist capitalist powers. You can't be seen, chumming around with them if you don't have to. So Kennan was a very prescient individual, very learned, again, an expert on the Soviet Union, and he showed it here. He got frustrated in a fairly short amount of time because nobody in Washington, D.C. Was listening to him. So he sent the famous long telegram you see here after months and months of his dire warnings and Jeremiads being falling on deaf ears in Washington, D.C. This telegram exploded because it was longer, and he kind of filled it with more dramatic, emotional jargon to get his boss's attention back in the U.S., but basically made the arguments I just mentioned to you there. The X article the next year, once he was back in the United States, it also kind of went off like a bombshell. X article, because it wasn't signed, it was anonymous. I almost said unanimous. It was anonymous, but everyone knew quickly that it was George Kennan that had to write it, including his boss at the State Department, the newly installed Secretary of State, none other than George C. Marshall, former Chief of Staff to Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. Marshall was none too pleased when he found out that Kennan was the author of the X article, and basically said, don't ever do something like that again unless you check it with me first. But Marshall was one of those impressed with Kennan who did listen to the long telegram the year before when it came across by wire and exploded in Washington, D.C. It was from that point on that people started to listen to Kennan's dire warnings about relations with the Soviet Union. So much so, and Marshall being so enamored with this guy's ability, he called him back to the U.S., gave him a job in a new department, sort of created just for him, called the State Department Planning Policy Planning Staff. It basically was an in-house think tank for the State Department. A bunch of egghead scholarly types, and he was that for sure. Under his leadership, sort of sitting around strategizing for State Department policy, and he only stayed in that job for a short amount of time, and then moved on. Though there were other talented, known figures that followed him. But while he was there, he authored the now famous policy of containment. And this is not the only, but it's the primary reason why he's such an important figure, right? The most important person that you've never heard of for today, mainly because he's the primary author of the containment policy. And so I say primary author because, again, he had a whole team on the policy planning staff. But as the boss, anything document that comes out is, more or less his responsibility, and he did much of the thinking, provided much of the brain power behind it. But the task was to figure out a long-term strategy as to how the United States is going to deal with the Soviet Union. An intractable foe, Stalin, a wily, foe, an enemy, not an easy, and the Soviet Union, a very powerful country. The Red Army, gigantic. The Soviets would soon have a nuclear weapon. They already had a vast military. So this is an unenviable, thing to have to do. But the policy of containment came out, and I'm simplifying this a lot. We don't need to get into the rough and tumble of it all, but it enlarged America's foreign policy commitments overnight. It just sort of metastasized overnight. Because keep in mind, we started with isolationism in this class. This is now not only not isolationism, it's not even internationalism, or it's internationalism on steroids. Because what the policy of containment said is that the Soviet Union and communism, it was always assumed that communism and the Soviet Union were kind of one and the same thing. That if there's a communist party in country X, it's being controlled by, being supplied by, being helped by the Soviet Union, which was often true, sometimes not true, but it seemed to always be the assumption. But what he said is that wherever the Soviet Union goes, with an aggressive intent to expand its interests, either territorially, geographically, economically, politically, militarily, the U.S. must be there with a counter thrust to keep them from being successful. So we must box them in, and anytime they try to get out of the box, we have to stuff them back into the box. So he wasn't saying, to take the offensive and send troops into the Soviet Union or send troops into one of the Eastern Bloc, Soviet-dominated Eastern European countries, or a newly, a new communist country like North Korea, China, within a short time. He's saying, no, this is primarily defensive. Whenever they try to get out of the box, we're going to have to be there to put them back in. Which then sounds like, well, that's not that big of a foreign policy. It's defensive. It's not aggressive. Well, first of all, it could be aggressive at times. The overall plan was to contain. But secondly, whether it's defense or offense, he's saying anywhere and everywhere around the world the Soviet Union goes to try to expand its influence, we must be there to contain it, which means a global power projection capability at all times. The United States must be prepared to go to any part of the world, anytime, multiple parts of the world if necessary, if a number of fires are going at once. And so this is a gigantic, unlike anything we've seen, gigantic expansion of American foreign policy, and this time with an actual doctrine, or a set of principles clearly articulated by Kennan and the policy staff. The long telegram, we can sort of skip that for now. Truman Doctrine. Truman, in 1947, went on the air and made a speech, basically that sort of defined what became known as the Truman Doctrine. Presidential doctrines are always, as far as I know, as I remember, they're always the presidents at the time, their approach to one or more foreign policy problems. Sometimes it's about the president's approach to the to foreign policy with regard to the whole world. Sometimes it's one particular part of the world. But there was a Reagan doctrine. There's, of course, the Monroe Doctrine. So many presidents have had sort of doctrines. It's always about foreign policy. And really what this is the president elucidating and making public what we've already identified as the containment policy. He didn't call it that in the speech, but that's what he was basically being guided by. In my words here, with a quote, Truman stated the doctrine would be, quote, the policy of the U.S. to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Truman reasoned because these, quote, totalitarian regimes coerced free peoples, they represented a threat to international peace and the national security of the United States. He didn't say the Soviet Union in there, but can anyone doubt that that's what he was talking about primarily? Of course it was. So this is his way of going public with the containment policy. A crucial aspect of America's sort of way of trying to deal with the Soviet Union and keeping communism at bay, keep it from expanding outside the Soviet Union, was the European Recovery Program, or Marshall Plan, of 1948, named after the Secretary of State George C. Marshall. Marshall, like Eisenhower, one of those people in our history that had a gigantic impact, on the military, and then turned that over and had a massive impact on American politics. So Marshall clearly saw the need for the United States to be involved in resuscitating Europe after all the destruction, physically, to bridges and roads and ports and factories and everything else. So the Marshall Plan was a program whereby the United States would give the countries that applied, all the ones in green you see there, the blue bar, of course, is the proportion of the money they got, but $13 billion recovery package. And $13 billion went a lot farther in those days, in 1948, than it does today. This is a gigantic gift of the United States to these various parts of Europe, which included West Germany, you see there. So at least part of the defeated Germany was now getting huge amounts of U.S. aid to build their economies back up again. Why? Well, we already know that this was part of that flawed masterpiece we talked about, America rebuilding Europe in a way that was designed to keep a world war from happening again. So this is part of the plan. It kind of did two things. One, it would get the European economies moving again, which was good for American business too. The Europeans bought, before the war, for a long time before that, had purchased a great deal of American exports, but they can't afford to if their economies don't get back up and running quickly. They've been basically destroyed by this, ultimately destructive of wars. So the idea, in part, was, well, if we help them to rebuild economically, though it'll cost us money, $13 billion as it turned out, it'll be well worth it because we'll get that money back and then some. It'll pay for itself in a short time once they get back up, because they'll get back up to full speed quicker economically if we inject our own money into them to rebuild infrastructure and other things than if we don't. But there's something else. I think the bigger reason that this was seen as important for the United States to do, and that is that it was believed that injecting money to get the economies of these countries, Great Britain, France, Italy, etc., moving again, would help prevent communism from arising and infiltrating those countries. And there already were communist parties, France and Italy. They just weren't in the majority. These were multi-party systems, so they were one of many. The communist socialist parties were one or two of many parties in each country. But there was genuine fear, especially in Italy, that the Communist Party had enough support where it wouldn't take too much for it to become a majority party and basically take over the government, by democratic election. And this was anathema to U.S. leaders, and they couldn't stand the idea. So it was believed. This could be wrong, but I think it does sort of ring true. The idea was that if there are previously capitalist economies, previously prosperous societies, were rebuilt quickly and they became prosperous again, it'd be much harder for communism to really take hold of this or that European country. The thought being that if people are comfortable, they've got a good job, they've got money in the bank, they're saving for their child's college education, and they're in a park one day and some socialist or communist leader gets up in a soapbox and starts making a speech saying, "Down with capitalism, it's a terrible system, we've suffered long enough under this." And everyone's in the audience saying, "Terrible, I've got a great job, I've got plenty of free time, high standard of living, my family's happy, got savings, and what are you talking about?" So it's in that kind of environment, or in that kind of environment, communism, socialism, Marxist ideas are not as likely to be met and greeted with glee. But the argument was, if we let the European economies rebuild themselves, they might be in the doldrums economically for years, decades. And then, let's say 10 years after the war's over, Italy still hasn't been rebuilt yet because they can't afford to, and everybody's out of work, and they don't have a lot of material possessions and money saved, and money for their child's education. Now, when that same communist agitator comes around and jumps up in a soapbox, people are much more likely to listen. So I think the American thinking here was pretty shrewd, that if we help the European economies get going again, that itself will help keep communism from taking power in these countries. In Italy, that plus the fact that the U.S. Actually helped to resuscitate the mafia in order to combat the socialists and communists there. That's true, by the way. Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, fascist dictator during World War II and before, had just stamped out the mafia. When the mafia doesn't function as well in a dictatorship, especially if it's a brutal dictatorship like Mussolini's, as it does in a democracy. Why? Because in a dictatorship, the dictator can just have the mafia guys arrested and thrown in dungeon somewhere. So what about our trial? What about our lawyers? What about our right to, be arraigned? Sorry, you don't have any rights. See you later. So Mussolini sent the mafia packing, and it's in the 1920s when he came to power that you see, and there's a direct linkage here, of course, the Italian mafia from Sicily and southern Italy pop up in New York City and other places, and have a firm, ongoing presence from that time forward. The U.S. was much better for them because the U.S. has a democratic system and a more or less fair justice system, which means you can sort of have more room to maneuver. You can hire high-paid attorneys. You can bribe cops and judges, those that are open to it. So they had more options here. But why did the United States help to prop up or bring back the mafia? Because they're looking for allies anywhere they can get them. And in some ways, the mafia were perfect allies in trying to keep the Communist Party from taking power in Italy. They also did it, as we know, by influencing and buying elections, or putting money behind political parties that weren't the communists, their enemies. But the mafia, what are they? People say they're criminals. Well, yeah, that's true, but they're capitalist criminals. They own businesses that are usually illegal. They traffic in illegal goods like drugs and whatever else. But nonetheless, they're business people. They're trying to make money. They're capitalists. And capitalists tend to not like communists and socialists. And sure, the mafia hated communists. They saw themselves as true blue capitalists, which in a way they were. And so they were perfect. They loved capitalism, they hated communism, and they were perfectly willing to and experienced at using violence against their enemies. Perfect. Send them in there. Right? So the Cold War was ugly. The United States was playing for keeps. We'll sort of see in a while why the rationale behind that. Right around this same time, the events in Germany were such, or became such, that it was clear from that point forward that at least in Europe, Germany was going to be the front line of the Cold War, particularly Berlin. Now, when the war ended, both the United States and the Soviets wanted, a full united Germany as it had been, in World War II. But the problem was the Red Army was occupying basically the eastern half of Germany, and the other allies, the United States, the British, French, were occupying the rest, the west part of it, and neither side would budge. So the U.S. wanted the country to be united under capitalist democratic auspices, and of course Stalin wanted it to be united under communist auspices, and neither side would compromise or give up that. So what ended up happening was the United States, which moved first, created a West German democracy, capitalist democracy. And then Stalin, then in kind, followed and created a communist satellite state in East Germany. So Germany went back to being split again, and became then West Germany and East Germany. And so that's what kind of made it the front lines of the Cold War. You cross the border, you're still in Germany, but you've gone from a capitalist to a communist country, or vice versa. Making it even more of a flashpoint and a front line is the fact that Berlin, right, the old capital of Germany, was in the eastern zone. It was in East Germany, the Soviet part that the Soviets basically turned into their own communist state. But because the Allies had been jointly occupying Berlin in the immediate post-war aftermath, the Americans, British, and French didn't leave Berlin. They kind of refused to. So what ended up happening, if I had a whiteboard here, I'd draw it for you, but I don't. The Berlin ended up being divided in half as well, right? The Soviet zone on the east side, the other allies on the west. And when these two separate Germanys were created right around this time, West Berlin became part of West Germany. East Berlin became part of East Germany. The East Berlin part is no big deal. It's right in its own country. But West Berlin is now an island in the middle of a hostile communist state. There was a sort of causeway and railroad going from the border between West and East Germany across the frontier to Berlin, so supplies could get in and out, medicine, food, trade, etc., because West Berlin is now an island that belongs to a country. It's I don't know how many hundreds of miles away that is, but right, they're an island. And Stalin is, in 1948, determined to test American resolve. He didn't, I think, believe the United States was going to stay committed to defending Western Europe against communist encroachment. And you could see why he would think that, since the United States history had been filled with sort of one isolationist pullback after another. And so he decided to test the waters. And it was simple test to do. He just used his troops to cut off the lifeline, cut off the causeway, the railroads, the roads into West Berlin, and it left the whole population of West Berlin without anything. And so what ensued for the next year from the Berlin blockade, as it's called, Stalin blocks it off, was the even more famous Berlin airlift, more celebrated Berlin airlift. For an entire year, the United States and their fellow allies sent one flight after another. You see one coming in here, day after day, basically 24/7, supplying Berlin with everything it needed to survive. About 200,000 sorties in a year, and about 2.3 million tons of cargo flown into Berlin. Everything needed to survive, and sort of keep the standard of living, afloat. And after about a year, Stalin finally stopped and realized, okay, the United States, I guess, is serious about staying committed to defending Western Europe. And that's, of course, true. This is a titanic effort. This doesn't have the same kind of heroics that a war has. But this is pretty impressive. The logistics alone, the entire year of planes coming in like every minute, not passenger planes, almost completely cargo planes, keeping West Berlin and its free population free and alive and well. So you could say the first round of the Cold War goes to the United States. U.S. wins, Stalin loses. But he did get important information out of this, and that's more or less what he wanted, or what he would at least settle for if the United States didn't back down. and it didn't back down. In the next year comes the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which is still around to this day. It's become controversial now, but it wasn't then, and particularly not to Europeans. The European powers basically begged the United States to be involved in it because Europeans had a fear, and they were, I think, completely right to feel this way, to fear this, that even if they all band together, they could not stop a Soviet Red Army, invasion of Western Europe. That Great Britain, France, Germany, West Germany, Holland, Spain, combined with all the others, their military forces would not be able to stop the Red Army from sort of just steamrolling through Western Europe and making it all communist territory under Stalin and the Soviets' thumb. So the United States, it was recognized as the one power that can check that kind of advance. And if the United States, is a signatory to NATO, it'll give Stalin great pause before he even considers invading any country in Western Europe, which was, of course, true. As crazy as Stalin may have been, and as much of a mass murderer as he was, and he certainly was that, he also was practical in many ways. It's clear from the records he wanted no part of a major conflict and war with the United States if he could help it, and he never did go to war with the U.S. So he understood. Stalin was a confident, brutal guy that used force, without any qualms whatsoever. But he also understood power, and he knew when somebody was at least a match for him, at least sort of even in power, and he knew the United States was, surely that. This, by the way, was a defensive military alliance, NATO. So it was designed to be permanent and to protect against the Soviet, or communist expansion into Europe. So this is a direct response to the Soviet Union's perceived sort of aggressive stance during the Cold War. Here's one of those areas where there's truth, and it's right for them to be afraid. The Soviet Union is plotting against you if you're Western Europe, the United States, but how things can get paranoid sometimes as well. And there was a war scare in 1948 in the U.S. and Europe where people, a lot of leaders, not all, were convinced that the Soviet Union was planning an invasion. It was going to happen right then and that year, which ended up not being true. So you can see some paranoia, even though the Soviets are plotting and they are threatening.